Look at him, can't even stand up for himself. The punk laughed as he spit right on the old veteran's boots, loud enough for the whole street to hear. But the veteran? He didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even blink. And just when they thought he was nothing but a ghost in the alley, a pair of boots hit the pavement. Slow, heavy, unmistakable. Chuck Norris. The crowd froze. And the words he spoke next? They hit harder than any punch he ever threw. Welcome to Chuck Norris Heroics. Let's uncover what really happened. The streetlights flickered, casting an eerie glow over the city's desolate corners. The night air was bitterly cold, biting at the exposed skin of anyone brave enough to be outside. Beneath the shroud of shadows, an aging man huddled in the corner of an alleyway. His clothes were tattered, his beard long and unkempt, his face lined with the marks of time and hardship. He wrapped his coat tighter around him, trying to keep the chill at bay, but the cold seemed to seep into his bones no matter how hard he tried. He had been on the streets for years now, ever since he returned home from a war he had fought in with honor, only to be forgotten by the country he had served. The medals, the parades, the accolades, those seemed so distant now. All that remained were memories, some clearer than others. Faces of comrades lost, the echoes of gunfire, the weight of loss too heavy for anyone to understand. He had tried to move on, tried to fit into a world that had moved past him. But here he was, alone in the cold, discarded like an old coat left on the curb. His stomach growled, empty. He hadn't eaten properly in days. His only solace was the warmth of the small fire he'd managed to start in a discarded tin can. He stared at the flames, mesmerized by their flickering dance, his thoughts drifting like the smoke that curled into the sky. It was a fleeting comfort, but for tonight, it was enough. The city bustled around him, unaware of his existence. People passed by without a second glance, too preoccupied with their own lives to notice the man who had once given everything for this country. As a car roared by, its headlights flashing on his face for a split second, he felt the sting of a bitter reality. He was invisible. To most, he was nothing more than a shadow in the night. But he didn't mind the solitude. In the cold, he was just one more forgotten soul. The veteran had once been someone who stood tall and commanded respect. His uniform, now long gone, had once fit him perfectly, a symbol of strength and purpose. But that man felt like a lifetime ago. The face in the mirror now was older, weathered, with eyes that had seen too much, too many things no one should ever have to witness. He had been a soldier, part of a tight-knit unit that had been sent into dangerous territories, fighting for causes that now seemed so distant and irrelevant. His comrades had shared everything with him. Their hopes, their fears, their last letters home. Many of them were gone now. He could still remember their names, their faces, their voices. They haunted his dreams, just as the sounds of gunfire and the smell of smoke haunted his waking moments. But the war had ended, and he had come home, expecting a hero's welcome. Instead, he had been greeted with indifference. The country he had served seemed to forget him, along with thousands like him, who had returned from the front lines only to find themselves pushed to the edges of society. He had tried to reintegrate, found a job here and there, tried to make something of himself again. But it didn't work. The scars from war, both mental and physical, were too deep. His hands shook, his nights were restless with nightmares, and the quiet of civilian life only amplified the chaos inside his mind. He had lost everything, his family, his friends, his dignity. The streets had become his home, the cold concrete his bed. It was easier that way. No expectations, no responsibilities, just the relentless passage of time. His fellow veterans would occasionally cross his path, but they too were lost, struggling to make sense of a world that had moved on without them. But beneath the worn clothes and the weathered exterior, there was a fire that refused to die, a sense of duty, of honor, that never left him. He wasn't just a homeless man. He was a man who had given everything, and maybe, one day, someone would remember. He had never imagined his life would end up like this. It wasn't a matter of money or status. Those things had never mattered much to him. It was pride, the pride that came with service, with knowing you had fought for something greater than yourself. That was the core of who he was. It was what had kept him going through the worst moments, through the pain and the loss. But now, that pride seemed to be slipping through his fingers like sand. He remembered the days when his uniform had gleamed in the sun, when his comrades had stood beside him, proud to be part of something larger than themselves. They were brothers, closer than family, each willing to lay down their lives for the others. They had been a force, feared and respected, their reputation carrying weight wherever they went. They had been the ones who had held the line when everything else seemed to be crumbling. But that was before the war had ended. That was before he had come back to a world that didn't seem to care. He had been promised things, benefits, care, a chance to start over, but they were just words, empty and hollow. When he returned home, the promises dissolved, and the streets became his reality. The worst part wasn't the struggle for survival, though. It was the feeling of being forgotten. He could still hear the voices of his comrades, the laughter, the camaraderie, the purpose. But now, in the silence of the streets, all he had were echoes. He watched the world pass him by, a blur of people who didn't know his name, didn't know what he had given. And yet, there was still that part of him, that flicker of pride that refused to die. He may have been forgotten, but he was not broken. He had fought for something once, and somewhere deep inside, he still carried that honor. The city pulsed with the noise of traffic, people rushing to and fro, oblivious to the struggles of those on the sidelines. The homeless veteran sat near a bus stop, his back against the brick wall, watching the world go by. It was a place he had grown accustomed to, where the streets were always in motion, but he remained frozen in time, a part of the backdrop, unnoticed. A few steps away, a group of young men loitered, laughing loudly, their voices carrying above the bustle. They seemed untouchable, brimming with the kind of arrogant confidence that came from not having to worry about survival. The veteran could hear their laughter even over the sound of the passing cars. He had seen them before, newcomers to the city, their swagger bold and unearned. They were the type to shout insults at anyone they deemed beneath them, their privilege radiating with every step they took. One of them, a man with a gold chain and a smirk that never seemed to leave his face, turned and noticed the veteran. He stared for a moment, taking in the dirty clothes, the tattered shoes, the grizzled face. The smirk widened into something sharper, a gleam of superiority in his eyes. "Hey, old man," the man called, his voice dripping with disdain. "You begging for change, or just wasting space?" The veteran didn't respond, his gaze steady but unmoving. He had learned long ago that silence was often the best response to fools. But the man wasn't done. He stepped closer, his group of friends laughing in the background. Without warning, he spit on the veteran's shoes, a disgusting, deliberate act of disrespect. The veteran's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening on the edge of his jacket, but he said nothing. The group laughed, but their laughter faltered when the veteran stood up, slowly and steadily. The moment was electric, charged with tension. The young man's laughter died as the veteran locked eyes with him, the silence between them suddenly heavy. The young man's smirk faltered as he saw the veteran stand. The crowd of his friends behind him grew quiet, unsure of what would happen next. The veteran's movements were slow, deliberate, his stiff joints creaking with every step he took toward the group. He didn't say a word, but his presence was enough to silence the street corner. The young man shifted uncomfortably, his bravado slipping just slightly. "What's the matter, old man? You gonna cry now?" he sneered, trying to force the arrogance back into his voice, but there was a hint of doubt in it. The veteran's eyes were sharp, focused. He wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking at the one who had disrespected him. And in that gaze, there was a lifetime of experiences, of pain, and of quiet strength that had endured more than the young man could understand. The veteran didn't answer. Instead, he wiped his shoes clean with a slow, methodical motion, ignoring the jeers from the group. His eyes never left the young man's face, a calm intensity in them that made the younger man shift from foot to foot. Finally, the veteran spoke, his voice low, carrying the weight of years that had passed through both war and abandonment. "You have no idea who you just spit on." The words hung in the air, their impact more forceful than any physical blow. The group fell silent. The young man tried to maintain his composure, but the doubt in his eyes deepened. He glanced around at his friends, looking for some support, but the silence was deafening. "You think it's funny," the veteran continued, his voice steady, "to mock someone who's been through hell and back? To disgrace a man who gave everything for this country?" The young man opened his mouth, but no words came out. He had no defense, no retort. All he could do was stand there, caught in the veteran's unshakable calm, realizing far too late the gravity of what he had done. The moment felt like it stretched into infinity, the air thick with tension. The street corner, once a chaotic mix of honking cars and passing pedestrians, had fallen silent. Even the distant hum of the city seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of the veteran's steady breath and the young man's shallow, uncertain gasps. The spit on the veteran's shoes, now a symbol of his disrespect, lingered like an insult in the air. The young man stood there, trying to regain some semblance of control, but it wasn't happening. His bravado crumbled with every passing second as he realized just how badly he had misjudged the situation. The crowd behind him remained eerily still, some of them glancing nervously at each other, unsure of how this would play out. The veteran's calm was unnerving. It was a calm that spoke of things far beyond the petty insults and teenage bravado of the young man before him. "Do you even know what you just done?" The veteran's words cut through the silence, sharp and direct. His eyes locked onto the young man's, unblinking, and for a moment, the young man saw something he hadn't expected, a glimmer of something ancient in the veteran's gaze. It was a lifetime of experience, of battles fought and lost, of a past too heavy for anyone to understand. And suddenly, in that single moment, the young man felt small. The veteran took a single, measured step forward, and the young man instinctively took a step back. The crowd was still, watching, waiting. The young man's bravado was gone, replaced with unease. The quiet that surrounded them was suffocating. "You don't get to spit on a man who's fought for this country, kid," the veteran continued, his voice low but unwavering. "You don't get to disrespect a life that's seen more than you'll ever understand." The young man's face flushed with embarrassment, but before he could speak, the veteran turned away. His shoulders straightened, his back no longer hunched from the cold or the weight of the world. He walked away without another word, leaving the group behind him, now frozen in place, their whispers lost in the wake of the veteran's quiet dignity. The young man's heart pounded in his chest, the anger rising like a tidal wave. The veteran had just walked away, his words lingering in the air like a challenge, and for a split second, the young man wanted to run after him, to do something, anything, to prove he wasn't intimidated. But the veteran's composure, his quiet strength, had shaken him more than he cared to admit. It gnawed at him, eating away at his pride. His fists clenched, and a bitter heat rushed through his veins. How dare that old man talk to him like that? He was just a homeless, washed-up veteran, barely hanging on to life. What did he have to say that was worth listening to? The young man's friends were still standing behind him, watching the scene unfold, but their support had faded into the background. He was alone in this. He looked down at the spit on the veteran's shoes, his anger swelling. It wasn't just about what had happened here. It was about the humiliation, the public rebuke. He couldn't let this go. Not like this. Not when he had been embarrassed in front of everyone. He had a reputation to maintain, a persona to protect. He was the young, untouchable guy, always in control, always on top. Without thinking, he moved forward, his steps quick and heavy. He was going to confront the old man again, show him who was boss. The cold night air didn't matter anymore. He was too fired up to feel it. His thoughts were a blur, just a need to prove himself, to put the veteran in his place. As he reached the alley's entrance, his hand shot out, grabbing a nearby bottle from a trash can. He wasn't thinking clearly. The anger clouded his mind, drowned out all reason. He felt a sharp jolt in his chest, the surge of adrenaline, and for a brief moment, he thought he could make the veteran pay for what had just happened. But then he stopped, just for a second. His mind flashed to the moment before, the veteran's calm face, his steady gaze. And for the first time, the young man hesitated. The young man stood frozen at the alley's entrance, the bottle gripped tightly in his hand. The rush of adrenaline still surged through his body, but something else was creeping in, something he couldn't quite shake. It wasn't just embarrassment or anger anymore. It was a deep, gnawing feeling he couldn't place, a shadow creeping over him, clouding his thoughts. He stared at the bottle in his hand, then at the direction the veteran had walked. For a split second, the world felt still, like the city itself had paused to watch him make a choice. His breathing slowed, but his thoughts remained chaotic, swirling with a mix of pride, shame, and something darker. He had always prided himself on his confidence, on his ability to dominate those around him, to keep people beneath him. But now, here he was, standing on the edge of something he didn't understand. The spit, the words, the veteran's refusal to retaliate, all of it gnawed at him. What was it about that old man? Why had he let him get under his skin like that? He wasn't supposed to care. It wasn't supposed to matter. And yet it did. The anger that had once been so pure and focused now felt misguided. What had he done to deserve such hatred? He didn't even know the veteran. He was just a man, living in a world that had passed him by. The young man thought about the years the veteran had lived, the battles he had fought, and how he'd ended up on the streets, forgotten. He thought about the way he had looked, tired, but not defeated. And for the first time, the young man saw something that had eluded him before. The veteran wasn't just some ragged figure to look down on. He was a man with a story, a man who had lived through things the young man could never understand. The hatred still lingered, but it began to feel less righteous, less deserved. He stood there in the alley, feeling the weight of the bottle in his hand, and slowly, he lowered it. The anger began to recede, replaced by an uncomfortable realization that perhaps he had been wrong. The young man's hesitation didn't last long. A few deep breaths, a quick shake of the head, and the rush of pride came flooding back in. He wasn't about to let the moment slip away. He wasn't about to let some homeless veteran, no matter how much life had beaten him down, have the last word. He could feel the crowd still watching, could hear their hushed murmurs, and he hated the feeling of doubt creeping in. He wasn't weak. He wasn't like the veterans who had fallen behind, forgotten by the world. No, he was in control, the one people watched, the one who commanded attention. He had spent his life learning how to move through the world with arrogance and charm, the kind of confidence that made others step aside. He had been the center of attention for so long that the thought of being ignored, even for a moment, sent a wave of discomfort through him. The veteran's words echoed in his mind, but he quickly drowned them out. You don't get to spit on a man who's fought for this country. The audacity, the nerve of the old man, standing there like he was somehow better, trying to make him feel small. It was the veteran's fault, really. His calm, his composure, it had cracked something inside him, something that had always been a shield. The young man's eyes narrowed as he spotted the figure in the distance, still walking away. He clenched his jaw, anger now sharpening every step. There was something deeply wrong with the situation, something that needed fixing. He had to prove himself, show everyone around that he was not someone to be trifled with, not someone who could be dismissed with a few words. He quickened his pace, determined to finish this, whatever it was. The veteran was nothing, just an old man who had once been someone. Now he was a symbol, a target for the stranger's arrogance, something to break down to reassert control. He wasn't about to let the man get the last word. He wasn't about to walk away defeated. Not today. Not ever. The veteran didn't flinch when he heard footsteps behind him, though he knew exactly who it was. He could feel the anger in the air, the restless energy of the young man charging toward him, desperate to reclaim the power he felt slipping away. The veteran didn't need to turn around to know that the man would come after him. That was the way of the world. Those who had nothing were often the first to lash out. But he wasn't bothered by it. He had lived through worse. He could still remember the first time he stepped into battle, the noise, the fear, the rush of adrenaline. That had been a fight that meant something. This was nothing. Just a young man too proud to understand the weight of his own actions. The veteran kept walking, slow but steady. His shoes scuffed the pavement with each step, the same worn shoes that had carried him through so much. His coat flapped against his sides, the fabric thinning with age, but it still protected him. It still covered him, just like the memories that never left. He had long ago learned the power of silence. Silence in the face of chaos. Silence in the face of disrespect. And so he walked. His steps were firm, deliberate, each one carrying the weight of years of service, of sacrifice, and of survival. He didn't need to prove anything. The young man's words, the spit on his shoes, none of it mattered. It didn't change who he was or what he had done. The young man caught up, calling out again, his voice laced with frustration. But the veteran didn't turn. His face remained unreadable, his shoulders square, his body unmoving in the face of confrontation. The anger behind him grew, but it didn't touch him. There was strength in his silence, a power that spoke volumes. He wasn't afraid, not of the young man's insults, not of the world that had left him behind. He had already fought his battles. What the world didn't realize was that it wasn't always the loudest voice that won. Sometimes, it was the quietest presence that carried the most weight. And as he walked, the veteran knew that the young man would eventually understand. As the veteran walked steadily down the street, he felt the tension in the air shift. The young man was still behind him, pacing faster now, the anger in his footsteps louder with each passing second. But this time there was something different, a quiet presence in the background that hadn't been there before. The veteran didn't need to look back to feel it, but he could sense the eyes on him, steady and sharp. The young man's voice, growing more desperate with each taunt, cut through the air. "You think you're better than me, old man. You think your story makes you untouchable." But the veteran remained silent, his back still straight, his pace unbroken. His mind was somewhere else, back in places he had long since left behind. But this moment, this noise, felt like nothing more than the petty distractions of a world he no longer cared to be a part of. That's when he felt the shift in the crowd around him. A whisper passed through the air, a murmur that was quiet but intense. It came from a woman standing just a few feet away, eyes wide as she took in the unfolding scene. She was seated on a bench, a book resting open in her lap, but she had been watching all along, her focus shifting from the words on the pages to the confrontation ahead. She hadn't planned on getting involved, but as she watched the young man press closer, as he continued to harangue the veteran, something inside her stirred. Her hands tightened around the book, her knuckles white. The arrogance in the young man's voice, the pure disrespect, it made her blood boil. Without thinking, she stood up, moving slowly but with purpose. She stepped in between the two men, positioning herself so she could block the young man's path. "Enough," she said, her voice firm, a quiet authority behind it. The young man faltered, his insults dying in his throat. He looked at her, confused and uncertain, but she stood her ground. "You don't get to treat people like that. Not here." The crowd around them grew still, waiting. The young man's arrogance faltered, caught off guard by the unexpected witness to his actions. The young man hesitated, his words stuttering to a stop as the woman stood before him, her presence unexpected yet firm. For a brief moment, the tension in the air felt like it could snap. The crowd, who had been silently observing, shifted uneasily. They were waiting for something, waiting for this confrontation to explode into something bigger. The woman stood with a quiet strength, the kind that demanded attention without raising her voice. The young man blinked, his bravado faltering for the first time. He had expected the veteran to back down, or at least respond to his taunts. But instead, it was the woman who had intervened, standing in the gap with a steady, unwavering gaze. Just as the young man took a step back, considering his options, something caught everyone's attention. A figure appeared in the distance, walking toward the scene. His gait was calm, confident, but there was something in the way he moved that commanded respect. The crowd parted without a word as the man approached, his eyes locked on the situation before him. Chuck Norris. He didn't need to announce his presence. The man's reputation preceded him, and the quiet confidence with which he walked forward spoke volumes. The crowd, still tense, seemed to hold its collective breath as Chuck Norris neared the confrontation. The woman, still standing her ground, gave him a brief nod as he stopped beside her, his gaze falling on the young man. The young man's chest tightened, a familiar unease settling in as the legendary figure stood beside the woman. He couldn't hide the way his jaw tightened, the mix of confusion and nervousness creeping up. He had never imagined this moment, facing off with a man of Chuck Norris stature, a living legend whose reputation was built on more than just movies. The veteran's silence, the woman's intervention, and now Chuck Norris himself. It all felt surreal, as if the universe was aligning to make him face the reality of his own arrogance. Chuck Norris didn't say a word. He simply looked down at the young man, his gaze steady and unblinking. And in that moment, the young man knew this was no longer just a confrontation. This was a lesson. The young man's breath caught in his throat as Chuck Norris' gaze fell upon him. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic speech. It was just a look, a simple, steady glance. But it carried the weight of years, of experiences the young man couldn't even begin to comprehend. Time seemed to slow as their eyes locked. The bustling noise of the city, the muttered conversations from the crowd, all faded away, leaving only the intensity of that moment. It wasn't anger that burned in Chuck Norris' eyes, nor was it the scorn the young man expected. It was something far deeper, something that chilled him to the bone. It was the quiet power of someone who had seen it all, someone who had been through battles and returned with his integrity intact. A man who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. The young man felt exposed, like every arrogant thought, every reckless word he had thrown out was laid bare in that gaze. The bravado he had been riding on moments before seemed hollow now. He swallowed hard, his mouth dry. The weight of his own actions pressed in on him, suffocating in the silence. For the first time in his life, he felt small. Not because of the veteran, not because of the woman who had stood up to him, but because of Chuck Norris standing there, watching him. He wanted to look away. He wanted to retreat, to escape the crushing weight of that stare. But he couldn't. His legs felt frozen, his body rooted to the spot. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to run, to avoid whatever was coming next. But Chuck Norris wasn't moving. His posture was calm, unhurried, like he had all the time in the world. The crowd around them seemed to sense it too. The energy shifted, the air thickening with a quiet respect that even the young man couldn't ignore. No one spoke, no one dared to move. In that moment, all that existed was the connection between those two men, the one who had given everything and the one who had disrespected him. And the young man understood, in the depths of his chest, that whatever was about to happen, he had no control over it. The young man stood there, frozen by Chuck Norris' unyielding gaze. But beneath the weight of it, his arrogance began to bubble up again, fierce and stubborn. It was as though he couldn't escape the need to reassert control, to prove to himself and to everyone around him that he wasn't intimidated. This was his moment, his arena, and no amount of silent judgment was going to break him. He clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as the seconds dragged on. Chuck Norris, the legendary figure who seemed to stand in direct contrast to everything the young man valued, bravado, defiance, power through noise, was simply watching him. The crowd felt it too, the shift in the energy, the way everything had grown taut with expectation. But the young man refused to let it show. He wasn't afraid. No, he was untouchable. He had been the king of his little world, his ego built on attention and spectacle. And now, in the presence of legends, he still couldn't shake the belief that he could make it all bend to his will. He took a step forward, his chest out, his eyes narrowing into a glare as he looked up at Chuck. "You think you intimidate me?" he spat, the words hot with defiance. "You think just because you've done a few movies or you've got a name, you can walk in here and make me feel small?" His voice was loud, more for himself than for anyone else. The sense of invincibility, that belief that nothing could touch him, surged once more. He was untouchable. This was just a game, another moment to be won. Chuck Norris didn't flinch. The veteran beside him stood silent, the woman still watching from the sidelines, their presence like anchors in the storm of the young man's rage. But Chuck Norris remained as still and unshakable as a mountain, his calm never wavering. The young man's words hung in the air, desperate and reckless, as he tried to maintain the facade. "But deep down, in that part of him that refused to admit it, he could feel the shift. The undeniable truth that he was no longer in control of this moment. And for the first time, his untouchable world felt like it might be crumbling. Chuck Norris didn't respond to the young man's words. He didn't need to. The bravado, the defiance, it all bounced off him like water off a stone. He simply turned, his steady gaze shifting back to the street ahead, and began to walk toward the young man. Each step was measured, calm, yet purposeful, carrying the weight of 1,000 decisions made in the heat of battle and in the quiet of solitude. The crowd around them, holding its breath, seemed to lean forward collectively, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But Chuck remained unhurried, his every motion deliberate, as though he had all the time in the world. The young man stood there, his chest rising and falling with each angry breath, his fists still clenched. He was waiting for Chuck to lash out, to show some kind of reaction, anything to validate the anger that burned in him. But Chuck wasn't giving him that satisfaction. He wasn't even breaking a sweat. The world seemed to slow as Chuck approached, the sounds of the city fading into the background, leaving just the rhythm of Chuck's walk, the quiet assurance of a man who had seen it all and didn't need to prove a thing to anyone. When Chuck was just a few feet away, the young man, still desperate to hold on to his pride, puffed his chest out, ready to snap another insult. But Chuck's gaze never wavered. He didn't even stop walking. Instead, he kept his eyes fixed on the young man, as though everything in that moment, all the noise and the chaos, was irrelevant. The young man's bravado faltered. The closer Chuck got, the less he felt in control. There was no rush, no aggression in Chuck's movements, just a quiet power that filled the space around him, like an immovable force. He passed by the young man, never breaking his stride, his calm presence speaking louder than any words ever could. It was in the way he moved, the quiet confidence that surrounded him like an invisible shield. The young man felt it. Something inside him cracked. He wasn't untouchable. And in that moment, for the first time, he truly understood what it meant to be in the presence of a man who was. Chuck Norris stopped just past the young man, his back still to him as he continued to walk with slow, deliberate steps. The silence that followed felt like a void, stretching between them. But then Chuck's voice broke through, low and steady, carrying a weight that seemed to reach the very core of the young man. "You just spat on a hero," Chuck said, the words simple but piercing. The young man froze, his feet suddenly heavy. The words landed like a punch, though Chuck hadn't even turned around to face him. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of his own breathing, ragged and shallow, the meaning of those words cutting deeper than any insult he had thrown. The veteran, the one he had disrespected, wasn't just some old man on the streets. No, he had been a hero, someone who had given his all for this country, someone who had fought in ways the young man could never understand. And yet, in his arrogance, he had dismissed him. Chuck Norris didn't look back, but the power in his voice made it clear he wasn't speaking for show. A man who served, who fought, who gave up everything. And you think it's funny to humiliate him. The young man felt his throat tighten, his stomach sinking. His mind was racing, trying to process the reality of what had just happened. This wasn't some petty street fight. It wasn't a battle for dominance in a world of bravado. This was something deeper, something real. Chuck's words weren't just about the veteran. They were about him, his ignorance, his reckless disregard for everything that had come before him. Chuck paused for a brief second, and the young man could feel his gaze on him, even if it was from behind. "You don't even know what respect is, do you?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the young man stood there, rooted to the spot, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. He had spat on a hero, a man who had fought and bled, and here he was still standing tall. The thought hit him harder than anything else. Chuck Norris' voice echoed in the silence, but this time it wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The truth was unmistakable. The young man stood there, staring at the space where Chuck had just been, a whirlwind of thoughts colliding in his mind. His chest tightened, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The world felt off balance, as though he had taken a step into a reality he wasn't prepared for. The words Chuck Norris had said echoed in his ears. You just spat on a hero. But what did that even mean? He had just been trying to assert his dominance, try to remind everyone who he was. But now, with every second that passed, the weight of his actions hit him harder. The veteran, the man he had humiliated, he wasn't just some homeless guy on the street. No, he was a soldier, a hero. How could he have been so blind? His entire life had been built on flaunting power, on proving himself to others through insults, taunts, and spectacle. That was how he had earned respect, how he had learned to survive in a world that didn't care about anything but what you could show on the outside. But this was different. Chuck Norris had made him realize that his way of fighting, his way of being, none of it mattered. It was empty. It was all a facade. And worse, the veteran's quiet strength, his dignity, had torn through that facade without saying a word. It had made the young man feel like a fraud. He glanced down at the ground where he had spit on the veteran's shoes. The action seemed so trivial now, so stupid. How could he have done something so reckless? What was he really trying to prove? The crowd had started to thin, murmurs still floating in the air, but he felt alone now. He wasn't the untouchable figure he once thought he was. He wasn't the king of the street. He was just a man like everyone else. The confusion spun in his chest, the pieces of his identity cracking apart. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure who he was anymore, or worse, who he was supposed to be. And the silence around him seemed to reflect the hollow feeling inside. He didn't have the answers. He didn't even know where to start. The young man stood in the same spot, his legs rooted to the ground as his mind spiraled, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. But the noise around him, the murmurs, the whispers, the fading footsteps of the crowd, seemed so distant now. It was as if the world had moved on, leaving him trapped in a moment that felt bigger than he could understand. But then, a voice broke through the fog of his thoughts, quiet yet firm. It's not too late to learn what real respect means. The woman who had stepped between him and the veteran earlier was standing near him now, her eyes still locked on him, unwavering. She wasn't angry, no. It was something else, an understanding, like she could see something in him that he couldn't yet see in himself. He glanced up at her, confused. Respect, he repeated, his voice hollow. He wasn't sure if he was asking her or trying to convince himself. She nodded slowly, her gaze softening, and then she spoke again. The veteran you spat on? He didn't just fight for this country. He fought for your right to be here, to act however you want. But that doesn't mean you get to take it all for granted. It doesn't mean you get to treat people like they're beneath you. She paused, letting her words sink in. He gave his all, and he's still here, still standing. You think that's easy? The young man felt something stir inside him, something that had been buried deep beneath the arrogance and pride he clung to. He felt a flicker of shame, but more than that, something else, a sense of injustice. The veteran, the man he had looked down on, had lived through things he couldn't even imagine. He didn't say anything at first, but as the words of the woman settled into his mind, the weight of his actions began to unfold. The arrogance he had carried around so proudly was now unraveling, and with it came the truth. He had no idea who the veteran was or what he had endured, and that realization hit him harder than anything else. A hero. He had spit on a hero, and now that truth felt like a weight on his chest. The young man couldn't shake the weight of the woman's words. He felt them crawling under his skin, pushing away the layers of arrogance that had defined him for so long. But it wasn't just the woman's voice that lingered in his mind. It was the silent figure of the veteran, the man he had so carelessly disrespected. The veteran hadn't shouted. He hadn't fought back. He hadn't even looked at him with anger. He had simply walked away, calm and steady, his silence louder than any insult or retort. And that, more than anything, made the young man feel smaller than he ever had before. He turned and looked toward the alleyway where the veteran had disappeared, the faint traces of his presence still lingering in the air. For the first time, the young man really saw him. Not as a homeless man, not as someone to mock or dismiss, but as a human being who had lived a life full of experiences he could never understand. A life he would never know. The veteran's silence spoke volumes, telling a story of battles fought not just on the front lines, but against the kind of isolation that had followed him back home. He had seen things the young man could never comprehend: loss, pain, sacrifice, but he hadn't let it break him. His quiet strength was a reflection of everything the young man had missed in his pursuit of meaningless victories and fleeting attention. The young man felt a pang of guilt. How could he have been so blind? The veteran had given everything for this country, for people he didn't even know, and here he was, on the streets, forgotten, disrespected. The veteran didn't need to speak about his past for it to be clear. His life had already told the story. For the first time, the young man understood what it meant to truly respect someone, not because of their appearance or their wealth or their fame, but because of the quiet strength they carried. He had spat on a war hero, and now, as the weight of that realization settled in, he could only wonder how he could ever make it right. The young man stood in the middle of the street, his thoughts a chaotic mess. The world around him had shifted in a way he wasn't sure how to navigate. The arrogance he had worn so proudly, like a shield, had cracked, and in its place was something he couldn't quite name. Something heavy. He needed to see the veteran again, needed to understand. He walked aimlessly, the weight of his guilt pressing down with each step. The veteran had been so quiet, so composed. There had been no reaction when he was spit on, no words of anger or vengeance. But there had been something else, something powerful in the silence. Something that, now that he reflected on it, the young man knew was the core of the veteran's strength. The veteran was a man of few words, but his eyes had spoken volumes, eyes that had seen things no one should have to endure. They were the eyes of a survivor, of someone who had faced the horrors of war and somehow come out the other side, still standing. Those eyes held stories of loss and pain, of moments when life had seemed too much to bear, but somehow he had endured. There had been no bitterness in those eyes, no resentment, only a quiet understanding of the world's brutality and a determination to keep going. The young man's heart pounded as he walked deeper into the city, searching for the alley where he had seen the veteran earlier. He wanted to apologize. He wanted to say something to make things right, but the words seemed too small for what he had done. How could he possibly express the depth of the shame he felt? How could he explain that, in a few short minutes, his entire perception of strength, dignity, and respect had been turned upside down? As he turned the corner, he finally spotted the veteran, sitting on the same bench where he had been before, his eyes calm and steady, as if nothing had happened. The young man hesitated for a moment, but then he approached, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry," he said, not knowing if those words would ever be enough. The veteran didn't immediately look up when the young man approached. He remained seated, his hands resting calmly on his lap, as though he had expected this moment, though it hadn't come in the way he might have imagined. The young man stood before him, his shoulders tense, his voice barely a whisper, but the words had weight. "I'm sorry." The veteran's eyes remained focused on the street ahead, watching the world go by. For a long moment, nothing else seemed to matter. The young man stood there, waiting for a reaction that didn't come, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was almost as though the veteran was letting him sit with the apology, allowing the gravity of it to settle in, to break through the layers of arrogance the young man had so carefully built around himself. The veteran finally spoke, his voice quiet but steady, like the calm after a storm. "Sorry doesn't change what happened, but it's a start." His gaze lifted, meeting the young man's eyes for the first time. There was no anger in them, no judgment, just a quiet understanding. The young man felt something shift inside him, as though the weight of his previous actions was finally being acknowledged, not just by himself, but by the man he had wronged. "I never meant to disrespect you," the young man said, his words coming more easily now, though they still felt too small to convey the depth of his regret. I was too caught up in my own head in trying to prove myself. I didn't know. I didn't understand." The veteran nodded slowly, his face expressionless but not cold. "You're not the first person to make that mistake, and you won't be the last." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "But it's what you do next that counts. You can keep walking the same path, or you can choose a new one. Arrogance is a crutch. It might feel good in the moment, but it only weighs you down in the end. For the first time, the young man truly saw the veteran, not as someone to be mocked, but as someone who had walked a hard road and still found a way to stand tall. And in that moment, he realized that the humility the veteran had shown wasn't weakness. It was strength, the kind of strength that could never be faked. The young man left the alleyway with the weight of the veteran's words still heavy in his chest. There was no immediate rush to move on from what had happened, no quick way to bury the shame he felt. The streets of a city that had once seemed so familiar now felt foreign, like he was walking through a world that no longer made sense. His usual arrogance, the sense of control he had always held, seemed meaningless now. It was as if the foundations of his entire identity had cracked open, leaving him exposed to a reality he had never bothered to see. As he walked, he could hear the faint sounds of the world continuing on around him. The honking horns, the chatter of passers-by, the shuffle of feet against pavement, but all of it felt distant. He couldn't escape the moment, couldn't outrun the consequences of his actions. He had humiliated the veteran, spit on him in a way that went beyond just an insult. It had been a public degradation, and the guilt had festered inside him ever since. He found himself at a crossroads, literally and figuratively. Ahead of him stood the street corner where the confrontation had taken place, the memory of it fresh in his mind. He thought about the crowd that had watched him act out of ego, the people who had likely gone home by now, but their eyes still seemed to follow him. It was as though they had seen something in him that he had been blind to for so long. And it wasn't just the crowd. It was the veteran's unshakable calm, the woman's quiet strength, and now Chuck Norris, whose presence had reminded him that some things were worth standing up for, no matter the cost. As he stood there, the young man realized he couldn't simply walk away from this. He couldn't just act like it never happened. The consequences of his actions were real, and they weren't something he could brush off. Not this time. If he truly wanted to change, to be the man he had always convinced himself he was, he had to face what he had done. He had to confront the consequences, not run from them. And that meant finding the veteran, apologizing again, and proving that he could live up to something greater than his former self. The young man didn't waste any time. He knew where the veteran would be. He had to go back to the alley, back to where everything had started. It wasn't just an apology he owed the man. It was a recognition of everything he had failed to understand until now. The arrogance that had once been his shield now felt like a burden, an empty facade that had kept him from seeing the truth. As he turned the corner and saw the veteran sitting on the same bench, the weight of his footsteps felt heavier than before. The world around him seemed quieter, as if it too understood the importance of this moment. The veteran looked up as he approached, but his expression remained unchanged, calm as ever. "I'm sorry," the young man said again, but this time the words felt different. They carried the weight of everything he had learned since that night, everything he had come to understand about respect, about strength, and about the cost of arrogance. "I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't understand what it meant to respect someone like you." The veteran didn't respond immediately. He just looked at him, his eyes still steady, but there was something there, a quiet acknowledgement of the change in the young man's voice. "Respect isn't something you give because someone asks for it," the veteran said slowly, his voice low but clear. "It's something you earn, and it's not about what you can take from others. It's about what you can give. You can walk through life demanding respect, but the truth is, it's only when you give it that you'll find it." The young man stood there, absorbing the weight of the veteran's words. For the first time, he understood that respect wasn't something that could be forced or demanded. It wasn't about status, power, or appearances. Respect was about humility. It was about seeing others for who they were, not for what they could offer you. "I get it now," he said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. "Thank you for teaching me." The veteran nodded once, and for the first time, the young man saw a flicker of approval in his eyes. It was a small gesture, but spoke volumes. The young man left the alley with a feeling he couldn't quite place, something like a weight lifting from his chest, but also something heavier settling in its place. He had said what needed to be said, But it was more than just the words. It was the realization that the man he had disrespected was far more than a homeless stranger. He had been a hero, a survivor, and the quiet dignity he carried with him was the true measure of strength. As he walked away from the alley, the sounds of the city seemed different, faint, almost distant. The arrogance, once his shield, felt like a memory that was slipping away. The lessons he had learned in just a few hours seemed to carry more weight than the years he had spent building his false sense of superiority. The veteran had taught him more than just humility. He had shown him what it meant to truly live with purpose, to stand tall without needing to be loud. The way he had responded to insults, to mockery, by simply walking away, by showing quiet strength, was a victory that spoke volumes. It wasn't about fighting back or proving anyone wrong. It was about the choice to remain unbroken. And that was something the young man had never truly understood until now. As he walked down the street, he found himself glancing back at the alley one last time. He half expected the veteran to still be sitting there, but when he looked, the bench was empty. The man who had quietly shifted the course of his life was gone, as if he had never been there in the first place. But the lesson he had left behind was permanent, etched into the young man's mind. In the end, it wasn't the apologies or the words that mattered. It was the quiet victory of a man who had been through it all, who had seen the worst the world could offer and still chosen to walk with his head held high. And as the young man walked away, he understood that the veteran's victory wasn't just in surviving. It was in living with the kind of dignity that couldn't be taken away. The young man walked through the city, but everything felt different now. The streets, once so familiar, seemed quieter, as though they were waiting for him to notice something he had never seen before. The rush of the crowd, the noise of passing cars, the flashing lights, it all seemed to blur, fading into the background of his thoughts. He was no longer the same person who had spat on a man he didn't know. He wasn't the same person who had tried to prove his worth with arrogance and pride. Something had shifted inside him, something fundamental. He thought about the veteran, about the quiet strength in his eyes. The words he had spoken echoed in his mind, not as an accusation, but as a gift, a challenge to live with honor, to carry respect not just for others, but for himself. The city hadn't changed, but he had. The world hadn't shifted, but his perception of it had. It was a humbling realization. He had always believed that power came from taking, from demanding respect, from forcing others to acknowledge his place in the world. But now, he understood that true strength came from within, through quiet resilience, through the ability to stand tall even when the world tried to break you. The veteran had lived a life full of sacrifice, full of battles fought not just on foreign soil, but within himself. And yet, he had never once demanded to be seen. His victory was in his silence, his ability to walk away with his dignity intact. The young man passed familiar faces, but for the first time, he saw them as they were, people, not pawns in the game of attention he had been playing. He began to realize how many others walked the streets like him, struggling, surviving, trying to make sense of a world that never seemed to slow down. The veteran's lesson had changed him, and in that instant, he knew he could never go back to who he was before. The city was still the same, but he was not. A world had changed in an instant, not in the grand gestures or the loud proclamations, but in the quiet, unspoken realization that real strength was something far deeper, something that could never be faked, something earned.